All right, it's 6:30, and I'd like to thank everybody out there for joining us for yet another virtual event at the Flagstaff Festival of Science 2020. My name is Brian Klomowski. I'm a board member on the Flagstaff Festival of Science and excited about this program, The Poetry of Spaceflight. I have a few housekeeping items first. First of all, we encourage you to ask questions during the event. On the website, you'll notice we have a box on the middle right-hand side that says submit questions to the live event. This is where you can type your name, location, and any questions that you might have anytime during the presentation. Now you might have to exit out of the full screen to see that box, okay? So be sure to ask questions. We love to take questions. Also note that all of these events are recorded. So if you happen to miss it or you have to step out, you always can see the recorded version of it on our website, scifest.org, and review the presentation there. So right now, it's my pleasure to introduce the editors of the book Beyond Earth's Edge, The Poetry of Spaceflight, Chris Kokinos and Julie Swarstad Johnson. Chris is an American poet and writer of nonfiction on nature and the environment. Chris is the author of 3 books of literary nonfiction, and was awarded the New American Press Poetry Prize for his poetry collection called The Underneath. Now, Julie is the author of Pennsylvania Furnace, which was the Editor's Choice winner for Unicorn Press, as well as 2 chapbooks, Orchard Light and Jumping the Pit. Julie has served as artist in residence at Gettysburg National Military Park and currently works at the University of Arizona Poetry Center. So it's my honor, and without further ado, let me present to you Christopher Kokinos and Julie Swarstad Johnson and Beyond Earth's Edge, The Poetry of Spaceflight.
Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you to all of you out there for joining us tonight to think about poetry and spaceflight and what poetry can add to our understanding of science. Chris and I are both so thankful to be here with you for the Flagstaff Festival of Science. And for me, it's especially a pleasure to be here. My own love of space began thanks to a visit to Lowell Observatory as a kid. So Flagstaff is a special place for me. So Beyond Earth's Edge is a book that brings together 89 poems about spaceflight, covering everything from the launch of Sputnik in 1957, through the Apollo moon landings, on to robotic exploration, the space shuttle era, and up to the present day, and then on into imagined futures. Poets represented in the book include everyone from US Poets Laureate and Pulitzer Prize winners to emerging writers, and there are even 2 poems by astronauts included in the book. It's a book that we hope will add to your understanding of spaceflight and that will also just lead you to be excited and to also maybe ask some big and even challenging questions about it. So this anthology came out of my work at the University of Arizona Poetry Center, which is home to a truly exceptional library of contemporary poetry. Through my daily work there, I kept coming across poems about space. And as somebody who's interested in space myself, I wanted to know why. Why are poets interested in this and what do they have to say? A colleague connected me with Chris, who's also a poet and an essayist who thinks and writes about space. And together we worked on putting this book together, bringing together all the poems that we could find that would kind of tell the story of the history of space through the eyes of poets. So you might be thinking, why poetry about space? Like, what can poetry add to our understanding of space flight? In 2014, when NASA conducted an early test flight of the Orion capsule, they decided to include a poem on board, and it was a copy of Maya Angelou's A Brave and Startling Truth, which you'll find included in this book. Charles Bolden, who was the NASA administrator at the time, had this to say about why they decided to include a poem. He said, quote, "Through art and the unique perspective of people like Maya Angelou, our discoveries and the new facts and expanded understanding brought to us by exploration are transformed into meaning." So poems can create meaning by giving us both technical details about space flight and by telling us about the emotional resonances of those details. It can offer us both snapshots from history and kind of ask big questions about what history means. So tonight, as we share from this book, we hope that you'll get a sampling of the ways that poetry can enliven and challenge and deepen our understanding of our quest to know and to explore beyond our home planet. So now I'll turn things over to Chris.
Julie, thank you. Yeah, I want to extend my gratitude as well to the festival and all the people who have been supporting us in getting this together, and to all of you out there whom I can't see, but I hope are listening and are interested in this topic. And I also just want to say a very public thank you to Julie for her leadership on this project. She did an amazing amount of work and has a breadth of knowledge about contemporary poetry that I find continuing, to be inspirational to me. I should mention as well that the book has a couple of features. It's not only an anthology of poetry. So if you were to buy it and see it, and we have a discount code for you if you're interested, it includes as well a portfolio of glossy color photographs of some of the key images from the space age, from the early days to the present. And it includes an essay by John Logsdon, who is historian and dean of space policy studies. And the other thanks that I would like to extend, that Julie and I would like to extend, would be to the Sloan Foundation for the Public Understanding of Science. Without their financial support, we simply couldn't have paid for the permission fees for some of these poems that we have in this wonderful collection. So I'm going to begin with, we're going to read tonight, Julie and I sort of back and forth a little bit. I'm going to read the first couple snippets here. We have essays that we each wrote about different sections here, moving, as Julie said, from the early days of the space age to the present and to these imagined futures. So I'm going to read to you here from this first section called Sputnik and the Race to the Moon, a little bit from this essay, and then I'll read a couple of poems. Sputnik and the Race to the Moon. Origins blossom and recede like fire and smoke from engine exhaust. When does the space age begin, or begin to begin? With Icarus flying too close to the sun, with the Montgolfiers and the first human flights in hot air balloons over astonished crowds in France, with the Wright brothers and those who followed with the rapid development of powered flight higher and higher? Did the space age begin in the imagination of an obscure Russian teacher, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who foresaw rocket-propelled travel outside the atmosphere? And with the first crude mechanical rockets launched by the American Robert Goddard between 1926 and 1941? Or did the space age begin in the imaginations of such writers as Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, each of whom sent humans to the moon in their Victorian era novels? A closer source, the Nazi rocket launches during the last gasps of World War II, when Adolf Hitler ordered V-2 rockets, the first long-range ballistic missiles, to be launched against England and other targets. Those missiles were manufactured and assembled by concentration camp labor with the direct knowledge of Wernher von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and other members of the German rocket team that the US government captured to hasten American development of such vehicles. The V-2 slaves worked in an underground factory. The space age there and then begins in pain and darkness. The failure to fully acknowledge this history should haunt all of us who dream of space. But conventional wisdom says that the space age began on October 4th, 1957, when the Russians launched an artificial moon called Sputnik, which came as a shock to Americans. And the poems that follow in this section are sort of a partial documentation of the Sputnik to Apollo era. It's a time of many firsts: the first satellite, the first man in space, the first spacewalks, first photos of the far side of the moon, and so forth. And we have fetching evocations of childhood memories of the launch of Sputnik, and a heartbreaking elegy for Laika, which I'll read in a moment, the Soviet dog that was the first animal to orbit Earth, and the only animal, so far as we know, to die in orbit. William Carlos Williams celebrates the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin, while other poets give us the spacewalks of both the Russian and American programs. Pablo Neruda's poem that we include gestures toward views of the space race from countries it was meant to sway, and its inclusion suggests the uncharted scope of global poetic responses. So this opening section covers a great deal of territory, much of which has sort of fallen under the radar as we have moved forward in time. So I want to read to you first Frank Pano's poem Laika, and he has an epigraph here, an informational epigraph. First dog to be launched into low Earth orbit, Sputnik 2, 3 November 1957. So this is right after the original Sputnik launch, just a month later. Because she'd gone unbroken by 3 years on Moscow's barren streets, she'd proved her will to survive simply by surviving, and so was chosen for a kind of brute salvation, a halfway gift whose bad conclusion was already written in a lack of funds and time and the keen knowing, like something obscene shouted through cloister halls, there'd be no way to take it back. And so began fierce weeks of acclamation, each cage smaller than the last to accustom her to stricture. The relentless gyre of the centrifuge and crude machines to simulate the cacophonous dirge of ignition, shrieking metal, everything it would take to lift a 13-pound mongrel into history. He called her Little Curly, Little Bug, as if naming the doomed, taking her home one night to play with his 2 bright-eyed daughters could make the great burden of her death a lighter thing to bend beneath when it came time to tighten the harness just once again and no more. To hold her in waiting 3 restless days within that aluminum tomb where she could stand or lie but never turn. And late October's chill settled its silver pall while the red lit counter counted down. 3 days and finally ascent, 3 anxious hours back on Earth before they saw her green tracery slow again to nearly calm, while the unshed core quietly kindled its black wick inside the polished dome. Listen, there is no other way to tell a thing that has no mercy in it. She burned up from the inside, fevered, frantic, blood boiled, 600 miles between herself and solid ground. And there's no faith to be placed in the weary myth of sacrifice, no way to make right the trust that was betrayed, the muzzle and fragrant paws and the mad tongue of it, how she was thrust into weightlessness, into the useless memory of steady hands, of the man who spoke softly, who turned at last from the wild extravagance of the round and riveted window about which he had been so adamant, as if she might somehow savor the breathless view, the spinning blue that beckoned like a ball tossed into a street she could only return to in flames. So that poem is one of the skeptical expressions of the beginning of the space age. And I want now to read instead something that's a little more uplifting. And this is the poem that closes this section on the Sputnik sort of race to the moon. And it's by a Scottish poet named Edwin Morgan. And this was read aloud at Royal Albert Hall on the 11th of June in 1965 at a huge poetry festival. And it's simply called For the International Poetry Incarnation. World scene, world time, space breaker, wild ship, starman, Gemini man dangles white and golden. The world floats on a gold cord and curves blue-white, beautiful below him. Vostok shrieks and prophecies, mariners' prongs flash to the wailing of Vashkad earth-size. She shakes men loose at last, out in our time to be living seeds sent far beyond even imagination. Though imagination is awake, take poets on your voyages. Prometheus embraces Icarus and in a gold shell with wings, he launches him up through the ghostly detritus of gods and dirty empires and dying laws. He mounts, he cries, he shouts, he shines, he streams like light new done. His home is in a sun, and he shall be the burning, unburned one. In darkness, Daedalus embraces Orpheus. The dark lips caked with earth and roots, he kisses open. The cold body he rubs to a new life. The dream flutters in a cage of crumbling bars, reviving, and then beginning slowly, singing of the stars. Beginning singing, born to go, to cut the cord of gold, to get the man newborn to go. Well, Morgan's poem is a bit of an outlier of enthusiasm and optimism, because still under the sway of the sort of romantic conception of human mechanized sullying of nature and a modernist sense of fragmentation and irony and technological doubt, most poets writing in English as the space age unfolds and the Apollo program gets underway, they reacted to lunar exploration with notes of hesitation, if not outright disdain. They included in their stanzas references to the moon's mythological and symbolic existence for so much of human history, an existence now stained, they thought, by Apollo's technological achievement and its only partial scientific justification. The reason for the program was, of course, largely geopolitical. It was a race to beat the Soviet Union to that stark gray surface, what Buzz Aldrin called magnificent desolation. The military connotations, despite the plaque that said we came in peace for all mankind, it was certainly on the minds of many poets responding to Apollo. And you can see that in this section. But one of the things that surprised me as we put this together was that poets writing after the fact, as we gain distance from the Apollo era, there seemed to be a renewed appreciation for the feat of landing humans on the moon and what it tells us about our aspirations for an uncertain future. And I think this may derive in part from our sense of growing fragility in what has been called the Anthropocene, the geologic age of Earth in which humans have so altered its surface and atmosphere that the continued vibrancy of our biosphere and indeed our own species' survival is at stake. With the discovery of water ice in permanently shadowed areas at the lunar poles, with an energetic private sector determined to reach the moon and Mars, maybe we can remember the Apollo era not only with nostalgia and ambivalence, but with a standpoint that holds them together. Along that line, like the Terminator that divides the lunar night and day, we can walk and appreciate both paradox and promise. There's certainly gaps in this section. There is a lot that's missing from poets' engagement with the Apollo program. We don't have any poems about mission control, for example. So we have a couple of samples here that I'd like to read, and then Julia's going to play a video, an audio clip from the contemporary poet Elise Benzel. But I'm going to read a couple poems here, one from the great poet Robert Hayden, the African-American poet, maybe best known for Those Winter Sundays and Middle Passage. But this is a poem of Robert Hayden's called Astronauts. Armored in oxygen, faceless in visors, mirror masks reflecting the mineral glare and shadow of moonscape, they walk slow motion, floating the lifeless dust of Taurus Littrow. And wow, they exclaim, oh boy, this is it. They sing, exulting, though trained to be wary of emotion and philosophy, breaking the calcined stillness of once absolute otherwhere. Risking edges, earthlings to whom only their machines are friendly in God's radar watching eye, they labor at gathering proof of hypotheses in snowshine of sunlight, dangerous as radium, probe detritus for clues. What is it we wish them to find for us as we watch them on our screens? They loom there, heroic anti-heroes, smaller than myth and poignantly human. Why are we troubled? What do we ask of these men? What do we ask of ourselves? And this is Stanley Kunitz's poem, The Flight of Apollo, and the first section is in prose. Earth was my home, but even there I was a stranger. This mineral crust, I walk like a swimmer. What titanic bombardments in those old astral wars. I know what I know. I shall never escape from strangeness or complete my journey. Think of me as nostalgic, afraid, exalted. I am your man on the moon, a speck of megalomania, restless for the leap toward island universes pulsing beyond where the constellations set. Infinite space overwhelms the human heart, but in the middle of nowhere, life inexorably calls to life. Forward my mail to Mars. What news from the great spiral nebula in Andromeda and the Magellanic Clouds? 2. I was a stranger on Earth. Stepping on the moon, I began the gay pilgrimage to new Jerusalems in foreign galaxies, heat, cold, craters of silence, the sea of tranquility, rolling on the shores of entropy, and beyond, the intelligence of stars. And now we're going to, I think, play a clip from the poem Lunar.
My name is Elise Bensel, and I am currently in my home in Brevard, North Carolina, and I will be reading my poem Lunar. Moons, mothers blacked out. Our initials written beside an emblem of absence. Perfect 28 days apart between the glossy pages of the wall calendar. What mattered was the beginning, the forecast predictions set in oceanic pelvic wanderings. Hysterical women were thought incurable because their organs would not stay still. The uterus pulled the body in accordance with the moon's orbit. As punishment, we spent blood-drained hours with the nurse before she ushered us back to class. Our teachers shook their heads at the terror of girls who wrapped hoodies around their hips, palmed tampons as they shuffled toward the bathroom. The moon must have been moving inside us. We gritted through the pain, learned to bear it. Nothing like labor, we were told. Our bodies boxed inside the weeks, the months, the years. Now, there are no longer any moons. We are irregular from hormones or unpredictable comets balling in the ovary or menopause, endometriosis. Our pain with a shrug, a smile, a marked patience for suffering as we wonder at the first men in padded spacesuits who conquered a distant satellite feared for centuries, their spaceship's trajectory calculated by women. The men swept up in a new field that released their bodies from heaviness. The women anchored to the ground even as their hips split open to new worlds that already existed. Every day, meteorites are hurled into the planet. The sound when the men re-entered the atmosphere was impossible to predict. No one could breathe from their diaphragms to expel all that sharpness from their lungs.
All right, thank you, Chris. And so now we're going to pick up with robotic explorers. It would be difficult to overstate how profoundly robotic exploration has altered our understanding of the solar system. Earth-based telescopes have offered glimpses of other planets for 4 centuries, but with the advent of robotic spacecraft and the missions that sent them on journeys no human could undertake with modern technology, our knowledge of the solar system has expanded exponentially, opening human imaginations to the stranger than fiction realities of our nearest neighbors in the cosmos. Robotic spacecraft blur the boundaries of what exploration means. Writing about this, historian Stephen J. Pine has described that blurring. Quote, "They were something more than dumb machines because they had a degree of autonomy and had to act within limits independently of their handlers. They were more than a simple ganglia of instruments because they carried their own motive power, which granted them the means to journey. Like any artifact of human contrivance, they exhibited a style that embodied the imagination and the values of their creators, which granted them a simulacrum of personality." The poems about robotic spacecraft that you'll hear tonight wrestle with that boundary between human and machine, vehicle and explorer, and how the new knowledge these robotic explorers send back changes the humans who receive it, both their understanding of the universe and of themselves. So John Updike, who's better known as a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, picks up on all of these ideas in his poem, An Open Letter to Voyager 2. Launched in 1977, Voyager 2 and its twin Voyager 1 conducted their famous grand tour of the outer planets, sending back transformative data about these distant worlds and their moons before continuing on their trajectory out of the solar system. This is a long poem, so I'll just read the beginning and the end to you. So this is An Open Letter to Voyager 2 by John Updike. Dear Voyager, this is to thank you for the last 12 years and wishing you, what's more, well in your new career in vacant space. When you next brush a star, the human race will be a layer of old sediment, a wrinkle of the primates, a misspent youth of some zoomorphs. But you, your frail insectoid form, will skim the sparkling veil of the void practically forever. As the frictionless light years and epochs pass, the rigid constellations Earth admires will shift and rearrange their twinkling fires. No tipped antenna dish will strain to hear your whispered news, nor poet call you dear. Ere then, let me assure you, you've been grand. You saw where we could not, and dared to go where we would be destroyed. You showed a kind of metal courage and faithfulness. Your cryptic, ciphered, graven messages are for ourselves, designed to boomerang back like a prayer from where the angels sang, that shining ancient blank encirclement. Your voyage now outsoars mundane intent and joins blind matter's motion. Au revoir, you rickety, free-falling, man-made star. Machines like songs belong to all. A man aloft is Russian or American, but you aloft were simply sent by man at large. Sincerely yours, a fan. So the poet Jessica Ray Bergamino lets Voyager 1 speak to us directly, describing the experience of turning to take the iconic family portrait of the solar system, a mosaic image of Earth, Venus, and the outer planets taken on Valentine's Day, 1990. For Bergamino, the image displays Earth's longing mirrored back to itself, the spacecraft sent to explore boundless distances, but ultimately turning toward Earth like a disillusioned lover. After taking the family portrait of the solar system, Voyager 1 understands herself as Orpheus in Plain Daylight, by Jessica Ray Bergamino. Past Pluto, I turned to watch the pale thrill of Earth spinning on without me. We both knew I could never return. She was already warring cold, beginning even then to melt. But what's true about leaving is true about looking back. Both require doubt for poignancy. And if I'm honest, we all know I turned because she called. I'd always been a mirror for her will. So this is how I measure distance, not in the leaving, but in the being left, in the absence of touch, the billions, in small orbits strung upon small orbits, spinning to some Celestine harmony we were never meant to count. I sent all I could across the distance, thrills of zeros and ones dimming to data on an astronomer's desk. How she saw herself then, fragrant, green, lit by the smear of sun, a bright crescent hung beside Venus flame, both of them pocked by longing. She thought she was the center of the universe once, and how close she was, straddled by fortune, while Neptune and Uranus clung to the dark edges of sight. So yes, I turned, because who doesn't deserve to see ourselves in the ghost of what loves us? And she sang in code to celebrate, programming my eyes to close and never open, making sure my last long gaze was her blue face becoming its own reflection. How silly I was to call this a love letter. Somewhere, Mercury is retrograde. So Carolyn Oliver, who's another contemporary poet, lets Saturn's moon Enceladus have its say, addressing the Cassini spacecraft as it makes a close flyby of the moon in 2008, dipping through a cloud of haze that included water vapor and organic chemicals. You'll hear specific details about the Cassini mission in the poem, but the moon also asserts that the spacecraft can't yet know it all. And we'll hear this directly from Carolyn herself.
I'm Carolyn Oliver. This poem is called Enceladus Considers Cassini. Little witness, golden anglerfish, plunge and surface. You'll never take my measure. Trawl for signs of life, hurl my reflection home, swim through vapor curtains draining me to chalk this boundary ornament, this filmy ring I can't escape. I know your exquisite instruments cannot scrape my craters smooth, or catch my oceans heave and seething hiss. Nor can your innards taste the ice that's never seen my father's face. Old Saturn, child eater, I've watched you jump through his hoops well trained. His patient maw waits while your gods arc you close. Soon, mission's end, a lick of flame snuffed out to keep me safe.
So robotic spacecraft, those machines with personality that go forth into places humans can't yet go, gesture toward our desire for the beautiful, the strange, and the unearthly. And so we'll turn now to the section called Humans in Low Earth Orbit. In the post-Apollo void, the space shuttle was presented as a reliable, cost-effective approach that can meet scientific, military, and commercial needs, flying more than 40 missions a year. But with the challenging dual goals of saving money and meeting demanding technical requirements related to military payloads, the shuttle, as it finally launched in 1981, was a very different vehicle from what anyone had hoped for. Across its 30 years of operation and 135 missions on 5 completed orbiters, it would never live up to what had been promised of it. Yet for the American public, the shuttle is one of the most recognizable images of the space program. The space shuttle era was ultimately one of impressive technical and scientific achievement. Low Earth orbit, the limit of the shuttle orbiter's range, may not have been a new frontier, but the public often experienced it as if it were. The length of the shuttle program's existence and the diversity of the crews who flew on the 5 orbiters made it a program that felt familiar, part of the fabric of public life that the poems in this section of the book inhabit. So I'll start by reading a poem titled Zero Gravity to you, and this is by the Welsh poet Gwyneth Lewis. In this poem, you'll hear an account of a launch by Space Shuttle Discovery in 1997 on a mission that serviced the Hubble Space Telescope. The crew included Lewis's cousin, the astronaut Joe Tanner, and he's addressed throughout the poem, which captures the fear and excitement of watching the launch and the reality of life on Earth for the astronauts when they returned. This is a long poem sequence, and we just have a portion in the book, so you'll hear me read 2 different numbered sections. So this is Zero Gravity by Gwyneth Lewis. 8. Thousands arrive when a bird's about to fly, crowding the causeways. Houston, weather is a go and counting. I pray for you as you lie on your back facing upwards. A placard shows local, shuttle, and universal time. Numbers run out. 0 always comes. Main engines are gimbaled, and I'm not ready for this, but clouds of steam billow out sideways, and a sudden spark lifts the rocket on a collective roar that comes from inside us. With a sonic crack, the spaceship explodes to a flower of fire on the scaffold stamen. We sob and swear, helpless, but we're lifting a sun with our love's attention. We hear the shuttle's death rattle as it overcomes its own weight with glory, setting car alarms off in the keys. And then it's gone, out of this time zone, into the calm of black, and we've lost the lemon dawn your vanishing made. At the viewing site, we pick oranges for your missing light. 13. There are great advantages to having been dead. They say that Lazarus never laughed again, but I doubt it. Your spacesuit was a shroud, and at night you slept in a catacomb, posed like a statue. So having been out to infinity, you experienced the heat and roar of re-entry. Blood in the veins then, like a baby, had to find your feet under you, stagger with weight, learn to cope again with gravity. Next came the tour of 5 states with a stopover in Europe. You let people touch you, told what you saw. This counts as a death and a second birth within one lifetime. This point of view is radical. Its fruit must be mirth at one's own unimportance. And now, although you're famous, a someone, you might want much less. Your laughter's a longing for weightlessness. So the space shuttle made it possible for us on the ground to see across vast distances by lifting observatories like Hubble outside of Earth's atmosphere. Hubble sees so powerfully far that it also allows us, in a sense, to see back in time, giving us views of distant young galaxies as they were long ago. For the poet William Wenthe, considering these images leads him to think back across the long history of life here on Earth. And we'll also get to hear this poem read by the poet.
My name is William Wenthe, and I'm speaking to you from Lubbock, Texas. I'm going to read a poem called A Photograph from the Hubble Telescope. And about this poem, I'll simply say that perhaps you agree with me that facts and data must be imagined into knowledge. A photograph from the Hubble Telescope. These luminous clouds and whorls of amethyst, jade, and coral are transmitted down to Earth as a babble of data. Monochrome of linty gray that arrives in computers at NASA gets filtered out and colored in with a menu of splendid hues, the better to illuminate the original edge of the universe and imagine the most ancient of days. In the same way, I suppose, cathedrals, stained glass windows pieced ordinary light of the sun into an old story of creation. Perhaps there is no story more ancient than our making of images, or more new. I picture a darkened chamber and the glow of monitor screen on the focused brow of a technician, like torchlight on the face of one who blows powdered pigment through hollow bones in caves of Lascaux.
In 2001, the Space Shuttle program came to an end when the orbiter Atlantis touched down at the Kennedy Space Center. In the years since, we've watched as commercial programs have come into their own, and NASA has now announced its own ambitious Project Artemis to return humans to the moon before continuing onward. In many ways, we're lingering on a threshold at this moment, waiting for the possibility of something that could be close or still a long way off. The poet Howard Nemerov captured this sense in a poem written early in the Space Shuttle program, and I think you'll hear how it speaks to us now as well. Witnessing the launch of the shuttle Atlantis by Howard Nemerov. So much of life in the world is waiting, that this day was no exception, so we waited all morning long and into the afternoon. I spent some of the time remembering Dante, who did the voyage in the mind alone, with no more nor heavier machinery than the ghost of a girl giving him guidance, and wondered if much was lost to gain all this new world of engine and energy, where dream translates into deed. But when the thing went up, it was indeed impressive, as if hell itself opened to send its emissary in search of heaven or the unpeopled world, thus Dante of doomed Ulysses behind the sun. So much of life in the world is memory, that the moment of the happening itself, so rich with noise and smoke, and rising clear to vanish at the limit of our vision into the light blue light of afternoon, appeared no more against the void in aim than the flare of a match in sunlight, quickly snuffed. What yet may come of this, we cannot know. Great things are promised, as the promised land promised to Moses that he would not see, but a distant sight of, though the children would. The world is made of pictures of the world, and the pictures change the world into another world. We cannot know, as we knew not this one. And so with that, I'll turn things back over to Chris to talk about the forward-thinking portion of the anthology.
Thank you, Julie. We'll close here with the section called To the Stars with Difficulties at Astra per Aspera. And it is a section of both sort of looking back. There are poems here looking back at sort of the retro-futurist view of the universe, say the Star Trek universe, Star Wars, and also poems looking forward, imagining us in outer space, in spaceships, going to other planets and into the stars with all that promise and peril. And for many readers, there is science fiction and there's poetry, and they're two different things doing other kinds of things. They're separate genres. But science fiction poetry is itself a subgenre within the larger sci-fi community. And as I said, this selection takes us from yesterday's tomorrows of, say, the Star Trek universe to these contemporary visions of the future, say Mars, in which humans are engineering its climate to sustain terrestrial life, and then onward to indigenous imaginings of a wider cosmos as both a technological and spiritual home. And this is only a small sampling of mainstream poets, science fiction authors who write poetry, and science fiction poets themselves. And with an eye to the clock, I'm going to just read a couple of, actually, I'll just go ahead and read Nikki Giovanni, and then we're going to play a clip from the poet C.S.E. Cooney. So Nikki Giovanni, the African-American woman poet, has a terrific sort of aspirational, almost manifesto-like poem in this anthology called Quilting the Black-Eyed Pea, and the subtitle is We're Going to Mars. And I'll just read a couple stanzas from this long poem. We're going to Mars because Peary couldn't go to the North Pole without Matthew Henson, because Chicago couldn't be a city without Jean-Baptiste Dusable, because George Washington Carver and his peanut were the right partners for Booker T. It's a life-seeking thing. We're going to Mars because whatever is wrong with us will not get right with us. So we journey forth carrying the same baggage, but every now and then leaving one little bitty thing behind. Maybe drop torturing hunchbacks here, maybe drop lynching Billy Budd there, maybe not whipping Uncle Tom to death, maybe resisting global war. One day looking for prejudice to slip, one day looking for hatred to tumble by the wayside. So with that, I guess I'll hand this over to Julie, and we'll run the video by C.S.E. Cooney so we have time for questions.
This is C.S.E. Cooney recording Dog Star Men in Queens, New York. All the men I might have loved have gone to Sirius. Sirius, the dog star, the dread star of summer, that cranberry bog, that red lamp district, promising scarlet women, scarlet waves of grain, a wine-stained sea. My lovely men are gone, leaving their braids behind them. They have left their braids, but have taken the veins of their wrists, their bony faces and transparent fingers, their cigarettes. Even the moist taunt of their throats they have stolen away, forsaking everything to be happy on Sirius. Oh, Sirius, your houses are made of bougainvillea leaves. Your rain is pink and balsamic. There is blood soup to eat, and dragons, and everyone is a surgeon. Like Magellan before them, my men have circumnavigated mystery without me.
Thank you, Julie.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, we're here to answer questions, and I see there was a question about how we became poets. I'll very briefly respond and say I'm not entirely sure how I became a poet. I found some felicity with writing early, in junior high and high school, and kind of backed into it in college. I was primarily a journalism and English double major, and I took poetry writing classes along the way, and then stumbled my way through, and I've kept writing poetry since.
Yeah, and I'd say I had a great 6th grade teacher named Mrs. Fout. So if you're out there, Mrs. Fout, thank you. That got me started writing poetry. And I loved it so much. We did a poetry writing unit in class, and I loved it so much that when the rest of the class moved on, she let me keep writing, I think maybe during some other part of class. So I've been writing just kind of on and off for a long time as something that it's just a way that helps me think. And really, I had a lot of different interests, could have gone a lot of different ways, but writing was something that I just kept coming back to. And one of the things I think is great about poetry is it's kind of an excuse to think about anything you're interested in, and is a really good way to kind of dig into other topics. So it's been a fruitful way to be able to approach things like spaceflight.
Oh,
And thank you, Steve, for that question.
Brian, you need to unmute.
Got it. All right, we have another question for you. And that was, what was something you learned while working on this book that most excited you?
I actually don't have an immediate answer to that. I don't know, Julie, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that most excited me was that, so I've been someone that's had an interest in space throughout my whole life, but I didn't necessarily have like a really cohesive sense of just the history of how spaceflight had happened, kind of everything that goes into these missions happening. And so I think in the course of writing this book, that was one of the things that really stood out to me, that it's this patchwork story of a lot of different motivations and a lot of different moments in time of people just kind of taking the opportunity of the moment and doing what they could with it to learn about the world beyond us, or learn about the solar system beyond us. And so that's kind of been the big thing for me, is getting this big picture view of the history of spaceflight.
Yeah, I in a way, my answer is kind of the inverse of that, in that I wasn't familiar. I knew sort of scattered poets here and there engaging with different aspects of space flight. One of the poets we include in the Apollo section is Archibald MacLeish, who was sort of patrician, man of letters, and a public servant. And he published a poem on the front page of the New York Times. He actually published an essay on the front page of the New York Times after Apollo 8, and then a poem after Apollo 11. So I knew some of these things, but I hadn't really, until working with Julie and seeing the sort of thematic arc unfold. And that was very surprising to me. In a way, it shouldn't have been, that there was this skepticism and ambivalence and some real disdain. I mean, some of the poems in the Apollo section are really sort of angry about Apollo, and we can talk about how that is reflective of public opinion in certain ways. But then to see that arc from skepticism to a more open and curious embracing of the possibilities of space exploration, even with the difficulties that Nikki Giovanni alludes to in her poem, that, we're going to take these things with us. Maybe we drop some of the bad things along the way. So that thematic arc was really interesting to me.
Yeah.
Excellent. We have some more questions. Actually, have a comment from Jennifer in Flagstaff. It said, thank you. That was wonderful. Such an interesting mix of science and art.
Thank you. We're glad.
Yeah, thank you.
And then another, then Jen, location unknown, has a question, and that was, what will you two be working on next?
A great question. I'm kind of in a period where I've just finished a bunch of things. Last fall, my first book of poetry was published. And then in the spring, I had a chapbook of poems that I've been working on that got published. And then this book is officially coming out at the beginning of October. Yeah, there it is. We haven't actually shown you. Here's what the book looks like. But so it's been about a year for me of like all of these projects I've been working on for years finally coming out. And so it's really exciting, but it's also this funny moment of being like, what do I do? You know, what's the next thing? So I've been writing, recently I've been writing some poems that are kind of in the forms of letters, which has been meaningful in the midst of, you know, being at home and being so far away from people. So have some ideas about where that might go, but not totally sure. So we'll see what happens.
All right.
Yeah, Julie's a wonderful poet, so you should buy her books. I have a feeling she'll keep writing. Nice to have things come to a conclusion. They're like, okay, now the slate is clean. I'm working on a book of nonfiction about the moon, and my MFA was in poetry. My background was in journalism, as I think I said, and so weirdly, like coming into nonfiction, I think of myself primarily as a nonfiction writer. And over the past few years, I've written about extinct birds, a sort of research-based book that also includes sort of cultural history and natural history and personal material. And I did the same thing with a book on meteorites, some of which was set, I was living in Utah at the time, and I spent a fair amount of time coming down to Tucson, which is a hotbed of meteorite dealers, if you don't know. Went to Meteor Crater and so forth. So in the interim, played with different ideas in nonfiction, but I've been very happily writing a book about the moon.
All right. All right. We have one more question, it looks like, and I think this is for either one of you. Can you tell us more about the poems by astronauts that are included?
Chris, do you want to talk about Al Worden?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that we learned in working on the project was that Al Worden, who just died a few months ago, sadly, who was the command module pilot for Apollo 15, which happens to be my favorite mission, came back and wrote poetry. This was really interesting. The Apollo astronauts, there's a great book, by the way, called Moon Dust by Andrew Smith, if you're interested in sort of the lives of the astronauts when they get back. Alan Bean comes back and paints, does amazing paintings. So Al Worden comes back, right? This jet fighter pilot, astronaut comes back and he writes poetry. So I ordered his book while we were working on this project, and we included his poem Into Orbit, which is a very revealing and sort of honest reckoning with that moment of liftoff and thinking about fear and competence, the fear of making a mistake. It's really interesting. Worden, his book is called Hello Earth, which references the fact that every time he came back in orbit from line of sight from the back of the moon to the side that faces us, right? So he was back in radio contact. Each time he did that, he said hello Earth in another language. So it was really interesting to include that, and had the honor of meeting him a couple times at Space Fest in Tucson. It was a gregarious and fascinating guy.
Fascinating.
I can tell you about Story Musgrave is the other poet, or the other astronaut poet who's in the book. He's a retired shuttle astronaut who actually has the distinction of having been on all 5 of the orbiters, which I'm not sure how many astronauts count for that, but that's a pretty big achievement. He also has, I think it's 6 advanced degrees, including a master's degree in English. So he's a fascinating person. But so we have a poem by him called Cosmic Fireflies, which describes when cosmic rays pass through the eyes of astronauts when they're outside of, when they're in orbit, it can cause the rods and cones in the eyes to fire. And so they perceive a flash of light that isn't really there. So Story Musgrave's poem touches on that. So it's kind of it's interesting to have a book where so many people are imagining what it would be like to space or kind of working with somebody else's account of it. But here we have these two astronauts giving us the firsthand account.
Interesting. We have a question from David Ross here in Flagstaff. The message is, hi, wonderful stuff. When Gene Roddenberry produced Star Trek, he wanted it to be science fiction and never fantasy. Do you think people today even know the difference?
Sometimes not.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes not. I teach science fiction courses at UA and at Utah State, where I was before. And I have the students go to the board and I say, draw what you think science fiction looks like and draw what you think fantasy looks like. Inevitably, eventually this experiment will collapse. But so far, every time they do it, you get rocket ships and robots and weapons and ray guns, that stuff over here, and then you get castles and dragons and so forth over here. So I think there's still a delineation, but yeah, movies have blurred the boundary to the extent that, at least in cinema, I don't know that a lot of people would pay attention to the difference. The science fiction writer and editor James Gunn said that science fiction is fantasy with a tight girdle on. So it constricts. There's some rules there that you have to hold to, and so I don't know, Julie. Did you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, thinking, and I wonder if I was also reading this question as kind of like, and maybe either way, that Gene Roddenberry wants it to be, or thinking about science fiction as like this is the possible scientific-based reality of what could happen. And I think kind of thinking about poems in the book that are more of the forward-thinking ones, you'll see ones that kind of engage with that more imaginative, this is what the world could be beyond us. I think that C.S.E. Cooney poem we heard at the end kind of touches on that. Whereas there are also poems in the book. There's a poem by, I was trying to find it, and now because we're talking about it, there we go. Elizabeth Lindsay Rogers has this wonderful poem called Arcadia Mars, which is from a book-length project that's set on this future version of Mars. She really kind of thinks through colonization, or thinks through this future community of people on Mars and what that might look like. And so she, I think, is really, although she writes about kind of the emotional resonance of those spaces, she's also really kind of imagining what that would be like in a very factual way. So I think you get both the kind of more fantasy future looking and the more science rooted future looking.
Yeah, that's absolutely, that's great, Julie. And your comments made me think too that there are a couple poets at the end of the book in that science fiction section that are writing from indigenous standpoints, and native indigenous standpoints, and projecting that into space. And one would hesitate to call that "quote unquote" fantasy, right? That there's this spiritual substrate under those imaginings that are deeply cultural and deeply rooted in very specific locations here on this planet. So those two poems are, I think, really pretty interesting in that way.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And thanks, David, for that question.
All right, it doesn't look like we have any more questions at this time. So let me just thank you again, Julie and Chris, for your time this evening. That you can purchase the book. It is available at the University of Arizona Press. And we even have a discount code, AZFLR. Okay, discount code AZFLR at the University of Arizona Press. I'd also like to remind our audience to take a moment and fill out our survey, which is on the front page of the website. Let us know how you like this. Let us know if you'd like to see more poetry and science as part of the Flagstaff Festival of Science. We have a lot of exciting events coming up over the next couple of days. We'll complement this presentation and many others. So please come on back, and thank you for being a part of the Flagstaff Festival of Science. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Brian.